JavaScript ES6 arrow functions. Functions can be thought of as mini programs. They take input, can process that data, and are able of producing output. They generally have 5 parts. A function has their return type, whatever they return, if they return data. They have a name, they have input, what they accept, they have a body, then they have a return statement, or if they return data or not. That is, they are mini programs. They take input, process that data, and are able of producing output. In JavaScript, they are created using the keyword function. Here's an example. The keyword function, the name of the function example, it takes no input, open and close parentheses. It has no body, but would be enclosed in curly brackets, and also has no return statement. So here, functions are created using their keyword, the name of the function, its parameters, whatever its input is, then its body, which in this case is enclosed in open and closing curly brackets, which is empty, and it has no return statement. So this is the simplest of a function example, using the function keyword, the name of the function, no input, so no parameters, no body, but enclosed in open and closing curly brackets, and of course no return statement. A single line using the keyword, the name of the function, open and close parentheses, and open and closing curly brackets. There's a variation on this in JavaScript called anonymous functions. These are functions without a name. Notice the keyword is still used. It is still a function using the keyword, but in this case, instead of having a name like the previous example called example, in this case, the anonymous function has no name, is simply the keyword function, open and close parentheses, and then open and close curly brackets. As functions are a kind of value, like everything else in JavaScript, they can also be stored in variables. So we can store a function in a variable. When this happens, the variable's name becomes the function name. It is accessed by the name of the variable. For example, we can store an anonymous function right here in this example, and then example, the variable would then become the function's name, which means we can access the function stored in the variable by using the variable's name as if it was the function. So in all practice, the variable then becomes the function's name and is accessed in the same way because it stores the value of a function, because functions are a kind of value, which is a little bit confusing but can be helpful to store a function in a variable, then use that variable as if it was a function. Renaming functions, in this case, or giving them new names to access them in new ways. In JavaScript, all functions also have access to the keyword this. Now, the keyword this can appear to be a little confusing at first. But the reason why the keyword this exists for functions is because a function is a kind of object in JavaScript. We know this because it has curly brackets. Everything using curly brackets in JavaScript is a kind of object. So the keyword this allows properties to be added to the function. This is allowed because a function is a kind of object, and an object can have properties. And an object, like an object literal, can have properties which are accessed using the dot notation. So notice the rules of the language all applying to now functions. A function is a kind of object. An object, based on the rules of the language, can have properties. Its properties can be accessed using dot notation. So the keyword this allows properties to be added to a function because a function is a kind of object. Again, a number of different rules all coming into play. In the case of using the keyword this, it refers to the function in which the property is contained. In other words, the this refers to itself. So inside of a function, this dot a property name, in this case, this dot another, the another is a property of the function example. The this refers to the function example. The this refers to the thing it is within. When using the keyword this in a function, this creates properties, as I just discussed, because a function is a special kind of object. And again, as a review, if it uses curly brackets in JavaScript, it is an object. In ES5, so again, pre-2015, the keyword new, an additional keyword, can be used to create a new object based on the function. So again, a function is a kind of object. So we can use the new keyword to create a new object based on that function. So like an object literal, then it would have the same properties. So we use the new keyword to create a new object based on an existing object. A function is a kind of object. So we can create a new object based on a previous object, in this case a function, and because it is an object, it would have properties, which means we use the new keyword to create a new object based on a function to create a new object with the same properties. Which is a little bit confusing, but think of the new keyword as basically saying, hey, I want to create another thing based on this existing thing. So because a function is a kind of object, it says, okay, I want to build an object based on this previous object. The previous object has these properties, which are defined using this keyword with a function. Again, this is part of ES5, which is a little bit confusing, but was the way ES5 handled things. Moving into ES6. So because all of this can be fairly confusing, using the this keyword, thinking about properties as functions and functions as objects can be very confusing. To help with all this, ES6 added arrow functions. Arrow functions are a lightweight version of a function that does not have its own this. It does not use the this keyword. It also doesn't have a name. So arrow functions then are even more lightweight by dropping the name and dropping this. So instead of using the this, that is having a this of its own, it uses a this of its context. This is again a little bit confusing, but applies to contexts in which functions would be inside of other things. There were cases in ES5 where there would be functions inside of functions inside of functions. In these cases, the this keyword and working with the this keyword could be incredibly frustrating because one would not be sure if the this referred to the inner function, the outer function, or an even outer function than that, because the this keyword would refer to whatever function it was within, and that became incredibly confusing. So arrow functions get rid of that. They are a lightweight version that do not have its own this keyword and do not have names. They are particularly useful for doing really quick tasks where a function or an anonymous function would be useful, but this now lightweight version can be used instead. Arrow functions are written using a shorthand. The parameters, that is its input, open and close parentheses, and then the arrow, that is the equal sign, and then the greater than sign, or combined, the arrow. So arrow functions take its name from this, from the arrow, the equal sign, and then greater than symbol. So they point from the parameters to the body of the function. So again, they don't have a name. They also, again, don't have the this keyword. When only one parameter is used, even the parentheses can be dropped. And so we see value, arrow symbol, and open and closing curly brackets. In fact, there is an even third variant, which I don't recommend people use, where for single values or single parameters, a value can be value, arrow symbol, and then a single statement as the body of that function. But again, I don't recommend that because it can become very confusing. In most cases, In ES6, an arrow function is the preferred type of function to use. This is especially true with methods like for each and filter, or other similar methods that would have taken functions or anonymous functions in ES5. Now, arrow functions can be used instead, again, as a more lightweight version that, again, doesn't have to deal with the confusion of using the this keyword and also don't have a name. So quicker to write, shorthand method or shorthand syntax, more lightweight internally. So when doing short calculations, arrow functions can be incredibly useful and are generally more lightweight to use and are often easier to write than other functions using the function keyword, giving it a name, or especially even using an anonymous function. So arrow functions are a special type of function, but again, do not have access to the this keyword and do not have names. So let's go look at some code in VS Code, and I'll talk about this a little bit more. So I have a review right here of ES5 functions, which are still true of ES6 functions. So they have 5 parts. They have what type of data it returns, called its return type, if it has anything. They have a name. They have input, which are its parameters, which is what's defined in the open and closing parentheses. It has what it does, the body of the function, and then it has some type of output, if it exists, which is its return statement. So the 5 parts of a function, which exist in all programming language: return type, name, parameters, body, and return statement. So here, right here, is a pretty classic example. We have the function keyword in JavaScript. We have the name of the function. We have its parameters separated by commas, x, comma, y, within open and closing parentheses. We have the body of the function defined within open and closing curly brackets. Then we have the body right here, but in this case is a return statement using the return keyword, which defines its output. So we send data in, x, comma, y, it performs something, x plus y, and then returns that result. So again, thinking of it as a mini program. It has input, it processes data, and has output. So pretty classic example. And then in ES5, if we were to use it, we could say, okay, var answer is equal to calling the function, supplying arguments. Again, arguments are data we send to it. Parameters are what is defined with it. Sending arguments to the function 2, 2, which would return 2 plus 2, and we would get answer would be 4. Pretty classic ES5 example. Again, we can also use anonymous functions, which are functions without names. And when used in this way, we can set, because functions are a kind of value, to a variable. And then again, we see here on line 20, we can use the name of the variable as if it was the name of the function and have new sum arguments 3, 3 sent to the anonymous function that is the value of the variable on line 17. So as one more thing, let's look at ES5 right here. So I mentioned this keyword and using properties. So functions are a special kind of object within JavaScript. So this means, of course, that they can have properties because all objects can have properties. So this keyword refers to a function right here, example. So we see this, the dot notation, a property, this dot object property is set to the value high. Now, functions cannot access properties because they're functions. However, objects can access properties. So this right here is an example using ES5, the rules of ES5, to create a new, using the new keyword, object based on an existing object. Because a function is a kind of object, we say, okay, create a new object that is example based on the model, the function example, the function object right here. So in this case, E would then be able to access its own property, this property, object property. Again, if that seems incredibly confusing, it was. And so ES6 gets rid of a lot of that. It improves how the language is used. Again, all of this is still technically valid because it's still part of ES5, But ES6 says, okay, well, in the cases where we don't want to worry about the this keyword and we don't really need to worry about the name of the function, we can instead use an arrow function. So right here is the use of an arrow function. Notice open and close parentheses around its parameters. It still acts as a type of function. We see the arrow and then pointing to the body of the function. Again, with a return statement. It's still following function rules, but in this case, it doesn't have a name. It also doesn't have access to this keyword, which we don't care about now when using the arrow function anyway, because it is a lightweight version. So this saves the arrow function, which is a kind of value, as if it was an anonymous function, and then here uses it in the same way. Notice that I shifted over in this ES6 section, I'm using let instead of var that I was using previously, which is still technically valid, but again is not recommended usage within ES6. So an arrow function, as a review then of this material, arrow function is a more lightweight version of a function. It doesn't have a name, and it doesn't have access to the this keyword, which actually makes it a lot simpler to use and way less confusing to worry about. It is a good lightweight function, especially useful with methods like for each and filter, which are more complex ways to handle data structures, especially as arrays and objects and things like that. For simple calculations, arrow functions are the preferred and highly recommended way to write quick things to do calculations instead of creating functions or even anonymous functions previously in ES5. Arrow functions are the preferred way to go. They're easier to write and they're easier to look at within code, requiring less lines of code, and again are even more lightweight internally because they don't have names and they don't have to worry about the confusion around the this keyword.